بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we have been looking at the recommended times of prayer after looking at the obligatory times of prayer and some of the difference regarding those. Sometimes people get confused by these issues, and the only solution to that is one is notes, but also is diagramming these things so that one has clarity. So in looking at the recommended times of prayer, we looked at, in the previous lesson, at some of the guiding principles related to the recommended times. Right? The asl with respect to these recommended times is that they relate to the recommended times for congregational prayer, for men. But then others have stated, so some of the Hanafi scholars said that the general principle of praying at the beginning of the time, unless there's some other reason, applies to others. But practically, there being one fatwa for everybody is easier, because that the asl of the salah is the salah in the jama'ah and in the masjid, and everyone else follows that in terms of their own practice. And that, but also in some of these things, fatwa may vary according to circumstances and different places, right? So, but in general, making the fatwa position one is a consideration a lot of the later scholars have taken, right? What's the recommended time? It's recommended for everybody, unless there's some secondary consideration. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So we'd stopped at Ta'jeel al-Maghrib. Okay, so we're looking at Asr time and the recommended Asr time, right? That وَيُسْتَحَبُّ التَّأْخِيرُ مَا لَمْ تَتَغَيَّرِ الشَّمْسُ. We looked at that. It's recommended to delay Asr as long as the light of the sun does not change, such that it doesn't become بِذَهَابِ ضَوْئِهَا, such that its light dims, so that the eye doesn't get dazzled by looking at it. And we said it's roughly half an hour. In summer months it may be a little more. In winter months it may be as little as 20 minutes. But safety is to consider at least half an hour before the end of Asr time. But until then you're in mustahab time for the Hanafis. Shafi'is get serious shock at that sometimes. But this is very much the recommended time with respect to the Hanafi school. وَالتَّأْخِيرُ إِلَى التَّغَيُّرِ مَكْرُوهٌ تَحْرِيمًا. Delay until the... Omar, are we on Facebook? Are we on Facebook? Why? Delay until the sun is setting, till the light of the sun changes, is prohibitively disliked. And it's come, right, in the hadith in Sahih Muslim, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم تلك صلاة المنافقين ثلاثا. And he repeated that 3 times. This is the prayer of the hypocrites. This is the prayer of the hypocrites. This is the prayer of the hypocrites. Because that's if done willfully, right? If done willfully, right? Right? يجلس أحدكم حتى لو اصفرت الشمس وكانت بين قرني الشيطان ينقر كنقر الديق. Right? One of them would, one of you will wait until the sun begins to dim in its light, so it begins to set, and it's like the horns of the shaitan, and then you peck like the pecking of the rooster. You peck like the pecking of the rooster. لا يذكر الله إلا قليلا, and you don't remember Allah but a little, right? So the delaying of Asr till that time, they say وَلَوْ بِعُذْرٍ مَكْرُوهٌ تَحْرِيمًا, even with an excuse, is prohibitively disliked. إِلَّا الْعُذْرُ الْقَاهِرُ, except the excuse that is overwhelming. The excuses that are overwhelming is the one that excuses you from, so for example, you're driving someone to the hospital, right? You don't say, let me pray Asr right now and let them die, right? Or, but let's say you're hungry and you need to eat. Unless you're in a situation where, someone has a blood sugar problem or something that if they don't eat, it's going to cause, harm or genuine weakness. Even then they should just have a few bites and pray first. Delaying Asr to this time is makruh, and we'll see the makruh time of Asr, but this is an important point, right? It's coming in the makruh times, but even during travel, it is, right? Even during travel, you should not willfully, you're stuck in a traffic jam, you're not able to come off the highway, but then there is remissness if you didn't take precaution to take care of that earlier, right? And we'll come to travelers when we come to it, right? وَلَا يُبَاحُ التَّأْخِيرِ لِمَرَضٍ وَسَفَرٍ. It's not permitted to delay, meaning to the prohibited time, even for sickness and travel, right? وَيُسْتَحَبُّ تَعْجِيلُهُ أَيْ الْعَصْرِ فِي يَوْمِ غَيْمٍ. It is recommended to hasten it on a cloudy day if there would be doubt about praying it on time. مَا تَيَقُّنِ دُخُولِهِ, after being sure that the time is in. خَشْيَةَ الْوَقْتِ الْمَكْرُوهِ, out of fear of entering into the makruh time, right? Similar to that, right? It would be recommended to hasten, right? Right? Hastening before commuting. Right? Especially in traffic. Right? It's recommended, like for example, when you're commuting for work and there's any possibility of making Asr prayer late, any reasonable possibility, then it would be highly recommended to pray Asr first before beginning a long commute, right? Especially if someone lives in the suburbs and they work downtown, for example, such that if a delay happens, if the train gets, blocked or this, that, it's better if the time comes in. And what having consulted some of the ulama about this, it's better to take the earlier Asr time if you're going to cause you to pray safely. And there's ikhtilaf. Some would say no, because but at least, because, and especially because some people genuinely risk Asr time. And also you have to keep in mind with respect to fatwa, a lot of people won't pray comfortably at a train station or in situations like that. So it's better for them to pray on the earlier time at work, even if it means, again, to schedule work as such, or leave slightly earlier, right? But if there's a few minutes left, you're rewarded for waiting that extra time, praying, and then initiating travel. Okay. وَيُسْتَحَبُّ تَعْجِيلُ صَلَاةِ الْمَغْرِبِ صَيْفًا وَشِتَاءً. It's recommended to hasten Maghrib prayer, both in winter, when the times are short, and the summer, when the times are long. لا يفصل بين الأذان والإقامة فيه إلا بقدر 3 آيات. And one does not separate with respect to Maghrib prayer between the Adhan and the Iqamah except to the extent of 3 verses. أو جلسة خفيفة, or a small sitting, a brief sitting. Just sit down to the extent of 3 verses. لصلاة جبريل عليه السلام بالنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بأول الوقت في اليومين. Because Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam and hadith Imamat Jibreel is an asl في باب al-awqat. Sayyidina Jibreel prayed at the beginning of the time for on both days. Right? And in our madhab, there is no nafil between Maghrib, between the adhan of Maghrib and the fard of Maghrib. Because and you can see it in the works on the hadith proofs, but the command came to hasten praying Maghrib unconditionally, right? And we'll see the disliked times, right? So then the issue comes up that, okay, so it's not mustahab in our madhab to pray 2 rakahs between the adhan and the iqamah of Maghrib. So what if there is enough time? What if they leave enough time between the adhan and the iqamah to be able to pray 2 rakahs? So some of the mutaakhireen, amongst them al-Kamal, said then it would be good to pray. But most of the mutaakhireen that this is a sunnah kanat thumma turikat, as we will see from the athar related to it. Right? Because it's mentioned. The hadith is sahih that that between each 2 adhans is a prayer. The Prophet ﷺ repeated it 3 times, and it's in the sahih. Right? And then he said ﷺ liman sha, for whoever wills. So this is a general recommendation, but several of the younger companions saw, and amongst them Abdullah ibn Umar said, I looked at the practice of the khulafa and the Ashra al-Mubashshara bil Jannah and the senior companions. I saw none of them doing this, despite the hadith. فعرفت أنها سنة كانت ثم تركت. It was a sunnah, then it was left. Right? وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام, and the beloved messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, إن أمتي لن يزالوا بخير ما لم يؤخر المغرب إلى اشتباك النجوم. My community will remain on the good as long as they don't delay Maghrib until the stars appear. Right? Right? Ishtibak al-nujum is when the stars become clear in the sky. But that's when the very disliked time happens. And we'll see that awqat of karaha of Maghrib, that slight delay is somewhat disliked, and that delay increases, particularly if the delay the karaha increases if there's a delay without excuse until ishtibak al-nujum, when the stars appear, and then there is karaha حتى بالأعذار العامة, even with general excuse, including eating, etc., unless it's a strong excuse, such as when traveling or someone's sick, they could only comfortably make 1 wudu, etc. So except for those who have excuse, the traveler, the sick person, for example, or someone for whom there's hardship, or if it's done without being a habit, a one-off, right? A one-off. But what I saw from God-fearing scholars, because in Damascus, every place has wonderful habits. And you guys probably know I have a soft spot for Damascus. The bad habits is, you would think that there was a naskh to Salat al-Jama'ah fil Masjid in Ramadan for Maghrib. If you go and pray in the Maghrib in Ramadan, It like feels like a ghost town. Right? Nobody shows up. It's like, oh my God. The Muezzin once confirmed, I only come because people like you are here. He's like, usually the Westerners, we didn't have much to eat, right? Unless someone invited us. And you go to people's houses, of course the ulama and stuff, it's different, but even religious people, frequently they'd eat first and then pray. Right? But the ulama would also say, but I guess because Syrians prepare so much food that, الترجيح بكثرة الطعام, that you got to give the food its rights. But no, so we'd see the ulama say, let's just pray the fard and نصلي السنة بعدين, right? Because you couldn't negotiate, Ahl al-Sham generally to pray the fard and the sunnah before food, right? But we'll come to the dislike times, right? Right? مضاهاة لليهود فكان تأخيرها مكروها, in order to be distinct from the Jews, so delaying Maghrib is disliked. إلا في يوم غيم, except on a cloudy day, right? If there's doubt about whether it's set, then wait a little bit till you're sure the sun is set, right? وإلا من عذر سفر, and except if there's an excuse like travel, أو مرض, وحضور مائدة, or if the food is presented, but before it gets to اشتباك النجوم. وتأخير قليلا لا يكره, slight delay is not disliked, right? Meaning تحريما, as Tahtawi mentions, تحريما بل تنزيها, right? It is somewhat disliked. وإلى اشتباك النجوم يكره تحريما, until when the stars become clear in the sky, because you have to be careful in cities, because of the presence of city lights, it takes longer for the stars to appear in the sky, right? Because of the city light dims the light of the skies. I say that's like the metaphor of materialism, right? That the false lights of materialism make the spiritual lights appear dimmer, but they're just as bright as they ever were, right? Right? وَالتَّأْخِيرُ قَلِيلًا لَا يُكْرَهُ. Now what if there's multiple prayers present? So he says, وَتُقَدَّمُ الْمَغْرِبِ ثُمَّ الْجَنَازَةُ ثُمَّ سُنَّةُ الْمَغْرِبِ. The order is that you pray the Maghrib, the fard of Maghrib, then the funeral prayer, then the sunnah of Maghrib, right? So the janazah is prayed before the sunnah of Maghrib, and we'll see the ahkam of janazah when we come to them. وإنما يستحب في وقت الغيم عدم تعجيلها خشية وقوعها قبل المغرب. It's recommended on a cloudy day not to hasten it out of fear that it occur before Maghrib time. لشدة الالتباس, because of how subtle it can be when it's cloudy. فتؤخر فيه, so it is delayed in it on a cloudy day حتى يتيقن الغروب, until one is sure that it has set. And where available, one can rely upon prayer timetables, but it's a communal obligation, right? ضبط تقويم الصلاة, having precise prayer timetables is a communal obligation, right? Is a fard kifaya, right? Right? ويستحب تأخير صلاة العشاء إلى ثلث الليل. It is recommended to delay the Isha prayer to 1/3 of the night, right? الأول في رواية الكنز, to the first third of the night. This is the riwayah of الكنز, كنز الدقائق of Imam al-Nasafi. وفي القدور إلى ما قبل الثلث, that it's recommended to delay Isha prayer till before 1/3 of the night, right? Okay, so here Imam Tahtawi has some useful points. He says it's يستحب تأخير العشاء إلى ثلث الليل, right? That most of the major books, right, قيده في الخانية, فتاوى قاضي خان. والتحفة, what is the تحفة? So there's, of course, the تحفة according to the Shafi'is is تحفة تحفة المحتاج in their madhab. But in our madhab, there's two great تحفas above all. There's تحفة الفقهاء of the great Alauddin al-Samarqandi, whose student al-Kasani authored the Bada'i', and whose student married the daughter of Alauddin al-Samarqandi, Fatima bint Alauddin al-Samarqandiyya, who was one of the great female jurists of the madhab. And during her father's time, she used to sit in the public majalis of her father behind the curtain. And when he would be stuck on something, she would nudge her father from behind the curtain. And when he was giving fatwa, he would consult her. And the fatwa during his time used to come out in two writings. As-Samarqandi's handwriting and another handwriting. After he passed away, the kursi at-tadris was given to Imam al-Kasani, and the same voice used to come from behind the curtain in the durus and when answering questions, and the fatwa used to come with two handwritings, his and a handwriting that was seen previously. And there's also a very romantic side to the story, is that they're said to have been buried next to each other, and tree or plant, a tree grew from both graves and became intertwined. Very interesting. So there's the Bada'i', and there's an interesting thing historically, and I've seen it actually with several female Hanafi scholars. Historically, there's been a very strong attachment to Bada'i' al-Sana'i' from female Hanafis. But anyway, that's a separate thing. So Tuhfa here, I don't know which one it's referring to. Could be Tuhfat al-Fuqaha of Alauddin al-Samarqandi, which is early, or it could be Tuhfat al-Muluk. But Allahu A'lam, we could check. Someone could check the two books, Tuhfat al-Fuqaha. Tuhfat al-Fuqaha is amazing, is one of the many works that took Quduri and built upon it. Tuhfat al-Fuqaha took Quduri and blended it into another, rearranged it masterfully. His student, al-Kasani, took Tuhfat al-Fuqaha, which is rearranged in a magnificent way, and he built a commentary on it in which he subsumed the matan disappears, which is Bada'i' al-Sana'i'. But some people ignore the asl, which is Tuhfat al-Fuqaha. Then when reading the Bada'i', you do well. If someone did an intelligent critical edition, they would cross-reference it with Tuhfat al-Fuqaha. Anyways, so someone could check which one it's meant here. That it's conditioned by the shita, the winter months, right? Winter months, Isha comes early. So if you delay Isha in the winter months, what's the benefit? Takthirul jama'ah, right? أما في الصيف فيستحب التعجيل لئلا تقل الجماعة. But in the summer months, right, it's recommended to hasten Isha and this is mentioned in the Nahar, لئلا تقل الجماعة لقصر الليل فيه, due to how long the days are and how short the nights, right? Right? And you can see the related issues. وفي القدور قال صلى الله عليه وسلم لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأخرت العشاء إلى ثلث الليل أو نصفه. If I didn't fear hardship for my ummah, I would have delayed Isha to a third of the night or half the night. And how much should it be delayed? It returns to ما فيه تكثير الجماعة, because some places, like that are closer to the equator, summer and winter months don't have very different times. Like when you're in Malaysia, for example, it's pretty much the same all year, right? But if you go to more northerly latitudes or more southerly latitudes, if you go to like Cape Town, for example, South Africa, right, there's significant difference between the times, right? وفي مجمع الروايات التأخير إلى النصف مباح في الشتاء. And in مجمع الروايات, right, delaying till half the night is permitted in winter لمعارضة دليل الندب, because of the contrasting proofs of recommendation. وهو قطع الثمر المنهي عنه وهو قطع الثمر المنهي عنه دليل الكراهة, right? right? لمعارضة دليل الندب لمعارضة دليل الندب وهو قطع الثمر المنهي عنه دليل الكراهة. So معارضة is what? Is اسم فاعل, right? دليل الندب is مضاف إليه, and the مفعول is دليل الكراهة, right? Because of the opposition of the proof of recommendation of delay, the hadith that we've taken, and to avoid the as-samar. Okay, now as-samar, right? He'll tell us about as-samar, the staying up at night, and he'll talk about that. Because the recommendation of that in winter months it's recommended to delay Isha. Why? Delay praying Isha, because the hadiths have come to not stay up at night socializing after Isha. So if you prayed Isha right at the beginning of the time in Isha, then basically, let's say Isha is 5:30, right? Then, it would cause difficulty for people, right? Is it a third of the night or half the night? It would depend to ما فيه تكثير الجماعة, right? تيسير وتكثير الجماعة. What would there be? Facilitation of congregational prayer and making it larger. It also depends on place, right? So that's the reasoning behind the recommendation, with the reasoning for karaha وهو تقليل الجماعة. And what's the disliking meaning of delaying of Isha is reducing the congregational size. لأنه قلما يقوم الناس إلى النصف الليل, because few people stay up till half the night. In the old days especially, because it'd be dark. Right? فَتَعَارَضَا, so the two proofs conflict. فَثَبَتَتِ الْإِبَاحَةِ, so permission exists. وَالتَّأْخِيرُ إلى ما بعد النصف مكروه. Right? But delaying the congregation, يعني التأخير إلى ما بعد النصف أي بلا عذر, right? Delaying Isha past half the night is makruh. This is to delay the congregation itself without excuse. Right? Right? Is makruh tahriman illa li'udhr, unless there's an excuse. Right? لسلامة دليل الكراهة, because the evidences for karaha of the delay remain sound. عن معارض, and there's nothing relating to that. There's no social hardship on people to stay up legitimately, right? والكراهة تحريمية, and this karaha is of تحريمية إلا لعذر, right? Right? إلا لعذر, right? Unless there's an excuse. ويستحب تعجيله أي العشاء في وقت الغيم, and it's recommended to hasten Isha on a cloudy night في ظاهر الرواية, according to ظاهر الرواية, لما في التأخير من تقليل الجماعة, because Isha, delaying it further would reduce the congregation, because people wouldn't want to be out if it's cloudy, right? لمظنة المطر والظلمة, because normally it would be cloudy, it would cause rain and darkness. So we have one more issue, right, here, and then we'll pray Maghrib, which is the recommendation related to Witr, right? That's mentioned in the text, but there's an important issue which is Mas'alat as-Samar, right? Staying up at night, right? So Imam Shurunbulali summarizes the issue beautifully, right? And these are issues, we keep pointing towards it, and there's a temptation to unpack each issue from the hadith, but that would take us far away from the topic. But this is where it's encouraged. We'd highly encourage you to follow along, especially where we pointed out the النهي عن السمر, right? The dislike against staying up at night for social purposes, like the prohibition against socializing at night, is one of those things that if people just practice this one thing, that idle socializing at night, they didn't do it, they would safeguard so much of their religion, right? Because so much harm happens, especially with families and so on, and that's considered al-fudul. There's a haja mu'tabara amongst it's silatul rahim wa ziyaratul ikhwan, maintaining family ties, visiting brethren. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about what do you do after eating? Right? What's the whole ayah? Yeah, it relates to the homes of the Prophet ﷺ, but beyond, right? Right? That فَإِذَا طَعِمْتُمْ فَانْتَشِرُوا. Once you've eaten, then go, right? But it doesn't mean go immediately, right? That فَانْتَشِرُوا after what's reasonable, right? That, and don't, so they say الضرر في الفضول, harm is in the excess, right? Someone wants to study at night, but they study so much that they miss Fajr, right? So that's why ضبط is very important. Okay, so he says وَقَيَّدْنَا السَّمَرَ بِالْمَنْهِيِ عَنْهُ. We have limited the staying up at night with what is prohibited. وَهُوَ مَا فِيهِ لَغُو, and that is that which there is فِعْلُ مَا لَا فَائِدَةَ فِيهِ, right? Is to do that which has no benefit. أو يفوت قيام الليل, or that causes one not to engage in night worship. أو يؤدي إلى تفويت الصبح, or it would lead to squandering the Fajr prayer, right? Right? And the hadith related to this are beautifully explained by Imam al-Tahawi in his Sharh Mushkil al-Athar, which is a brilliant work. Where he brings hadith that appear to be conflicting, and he explains how they're fitted together. So the greatest work on the subject. But others have explained it too. But Imam Tahawi's work can be difficult. What we'd recommend is if we can see the related set of hadiths from Mishkat al-Masabih with the commentary of Mullah Ali al-Qari, for example. Someone could share that. If you look for As-Samar in Mirqat al-Mafatih, Sharh Mishkat al-Masabih, you should find it and you could share it. If you have any trouble, we can talk outside class. أما إذا كان السمر لمهمة. As for if the staying up at night and socializing, right, is for something important. And At-Tahtawi says, what's an example of something important? He says, كتدبير مصالح المسلمين, such as planning the interests of the Muslims. كما كان صلى الله عليه وسلم يفعله أي أحيانا مع سيدنا أبي بكر رضي الله تعالى عنه. And it's mentioned in, there's chapters on the permission to stay up at night for socializing. أو قراءة القرآن, or reciting the Quran. وذكر وحكايات الصالحين, or the stories of the righteous. ومذاكرة فقه, or group review of fiqh, or the علوم الشرعية. Right? Right? And they say that mudhakara is what more than one person does. Tahtawi says, وَمِثْلُهَا مُطَالَعَتُهُ فِي خَاصَّةِ نَفْسِهِ. And likewise, studying on one's own. وَحَدِيثٍ مَعَ ضَيْفٍ, or to talk to a guest. Right? Right? And this is al-hadith alladhi la ithma fihi, in which there's no sin, right? And doesn't have the harmful meanings that were previously mentioned. فَلَا بَأْسَ بِهِ, but there is nothing wrong with it, right? But لا بأس يفيد ما قد يكون خلافه أولى, that it could be harmful, meaning if you do these legitimate things, but resulting in, in harm, right? By staying up too late, etc. وَالنَّهْيُ لِيَكُونَ ختم الصحيفة بعبادة, and the discouragement in the hadiths is for one to close one's book of good deeds with worship. كما بدأت بها, as it was begun with it when one woke up. ليمحى ما بينهما من الزلات, in order to wipe away what is between them of slips. إن الحسنات يذهبن السيئات, truly good deeds wipe away bad deeds. From Surah Hud 114. ويستحب تأخير صلاة الوتر. We'll look at witr after we engage in witr al-nahar, after we do maghrib inshallah. So we will after 10 minutes continue with Salat al-Witr, and there's some fiqh related to Salat al-Witr, and then we'll get to the disliked times bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Adhan, please. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we reached the recommended time for witr. Right? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَيُسْتَحَبُّ تَأْخِيرُ صَلَاةِ الْوِتْرِ. It is recommended to delay the witr prayer. Now the word witr, he says, ضد الشفع بسكون التاء وفتح الواو. Right? وكسرها. So you can say al-watr and al-witr. Right? But اعتاد العلماء to say al-witr. Right? إلى قبيل آخر الليل, to just before the end of the night. لمن يثق بالانتباه. So for someone who is sure of being able to get up at the end of the night. وأن لا يوتر قبل النوم. ويستحب, and it's recommended not to perform witr before going to sleep. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من خاف أن لا يقوم آخر الليل فليوتر أوله. So whoever is fearful of not getting up at the end of the night, let them perform witr at the beginning of the night. ومن طمع أن يقوم آخر الليل, and whoever is avid to wake up at the end of the night, فليوتر آخره. So let them perform witr at the end. But طمع here is someone who's avid and avid and sure. من طمع ووثق. Now that's مفهوم ضمنا, because of what's come before. Right? Right? That's why Imam al-Tahtawi says, المراد به الوثوق بالانتباه آخره. What's meant by it is to be sure to get up at the end of the night, بدلالة أول الحديث, by what's indicated by the beginning of the hadith. Right? That whoever fears not to be able to get up at the end of the night, let them pray at the beginning of the night, i.e. before they sleep. And whoever is avid, meaning whoever does not fear being unable to get up and is keen to get up at the end of the night, then, right? Right? فَإِنَّ صَلَاةَ اللَّيْلِ مَشْهُودَةً. For night prayer is witnessed. Because all prayer is witnessed. فهذه يعني هذه شهادة خاصة. Right? 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 وَذَلِكَ أَفْضَلُ. And that is best. Right? But several of the companions were advised by the Prophet ﷺ to pray before going to sleep. Right? Amongst them is a hadith of Sayyidina Abi Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, أوصاني خليلي بثلاث. Right? My dearly beloved one gave me 3 advices. You can look up the hadith. منها أن أوتر قبل النوم. To perform witr before going to sleep. And this is related to when he was physically very weak, so he couldn't be sure of getting up at the end of the night. Right? Because of his inhimak في طلب الحديث, because of his giving his entirety to seeking knowledge of hadith. رضي الله تعالى عنه. وسنذكر الخلاف في وتر رمضان. And he said we'll mention the اختلاف with respect to the witr of Ramadan. Is it better to pray it in congregation after Taraweeh? And the argument of those who say this is that كل ما فيه جماعة مشروعة فالجماعة فيه أفضل. That any prayer in which there is a legislated congregation, then for men, praying it in congregation is better. Or is that given precedence? Or the recommendation of delaying Isha, of delaying witr till the end of the night, does that apply even in Ramadan? And we'll see that. Now, one of the mistakes people make is that if one does witr, what's the ruling of nafil ba'd al-witr in general? Huh? Completely, no, it's not mubah, it's mustahab. يبقى على الاستحباب. A lot of people are confused. Right? Right? So Imam al-Tahtawi says فلو صلى الوتر ونام ثم استيقظ وتنفل بعده لا كراهة. If one prays witr and sleeps and then wakes up and makes nafil, there is no karaha. أو and one just missed out on what would have been absolutely speaking better, right? Right? And in our copy of they keep making this mistake. He says أطلق المصنف في حاشية الدر, it's في حاشية الدرر. Right? What do you have, Amar? أطلق المصنف في, what do you have our same copy?
I have حاشية الدر.
That's wrong. It's الدرر. Okay. So in short, if, of course, it's recommended to make one's last, to make Qiyam al-Layl one's habit, tahajjud one's habit. If tahajjud is one's invariable habit, then one prays witr during with one's tahajjud. Otherwise, even if one prays it 5-6 days a week but misses 1 or 2 days a week, then one would do it before going to sleep. But it still remains recommended to get up for tahajjud. If you do it with, a lot of the ulama would tell the common person, says, do you pray, you simplify, right? Do you get up every night for tahajjud? No. Says, until you do, pray your witr with your isha. Isha, sunnah, witr. Just until you've made a full, until like a week will go by without you missing it, right? Because most people's resolve is not a stretch. So you're praying your isha, do your sunnah, your nafil, your witr, do it and move on. But then you've done that, then you want to pray after, even before sleeping. There's no karaha whatsoever of salah qabla al-nawm or ba'd al-nawm. Okay. Then he mentions فصل في الأوقات المكروهة, right? So the disliked times, there's different types of disliked times, right? Some times are invalid to pray the fard in. So the disliked times you look at, there's disliked times in which prayer is not. There's disliked times with respect to the fard, and there's disliked times with respect to the nafil. Then there's disliked times with respect to ada, and these times the ruling of ada and qada is different, of current performance and makeups. And then there's disliked times with respect to nafil, and they can be divided in other ways as well, right? So, you do well to diagram these, right? And this chapter, there's a micro exercise. This is a chapter where please diagram the chapter on the disliked times of prayer carefully, thoughtfully, from the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya. So we should share the PDF of the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya. It's very good. It's also good practice, because if you can figure out how to read the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya comfortably, then everything else after that is like. And if you struggle to read the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya, then you should renew your resolve to do more nahu, and because it was written for primary school students. Al-Hadiyatu al-Ala'iyya li talamidh al-makatib al-ibtida'iyya. This is for maktab students. Like before people went to the madrasa, they would go, just take that from Shaykh Yusuf, to the maktab, Right? Astaghfirullah, Sidi. غلبناكم, Sidi. Barakallah ta'ala fikum. Just be very careful, guys. This is dark coffee. Yeah. 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 So, but this is also very important, this diagramming of the section on the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya with respect to the dislike times, because people get very confused by the different types of dislike times. How does the dislike time with respect to the fard affect the current performance, and how does it affect the qada? Right? And then, what's the ruling of the nafil? Right? So, be attentive, but it's also good to spend time trying to decipher things oneself as well. Right? So, let's see. He tells us, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, ثلاثة أوقات لا يصح فيها شيء من الفرائض والواجبات التي لزمت في الذمة قبل دخولها. There are 3 times in which no fard nor wajib prayer that was due upon one, lazimat fi dhimma, right? That was due upon one is valid. Right? In these 3 times, right? Lazimat fi dhimma qabla dukhul, that became due upon one before the time entered. Right? Al-awqat al-makruha, right? So because he says faslun, this chapter in this, he says, meaning in the dislike times. Right? Right? So what's meant by, so what happens, we saw that the sabab of the salah, sabab wujub al-salah, or sabab ada' al-salah, right? Umuman, generally, the sabab for the prayer is al-waqt. Right? Umuma, in a general way. Right? Now, the sabab haqiqi, what they mention is the khitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the sabab al-zahir, al-aam, is dukhul al-waqt. But the sabab al-mubashir, the specific time, is al-juz' alladhi ta'allaqa bihi al-shuru' fi as-salah, is the moment in which you began praying. That's why? Because that's when did you pray? When you entered the prayer. Of course, how exactly you entered the prayer, that's a tricky thing, as we'll see when we look at the tahrima. Right? But don't get bad ideas. Can you give the takbir before the beginning of the time? Can you? Yes? No? It is considered a shart. So it's valid but sinful. Don't do it. It's sinful. Someone says, Allahu Akbar. They looked at the time and there's a minute left. But they didn't do anything. They just waited till the time entered. Don't do it. It'd be valid. Okay? Don't do it. Right? Makruh tahriman and istihza, and there's ma'na of istihza there. So don't do things like that. Because every moment during the time is fit to pray. Right? But the prayer, as-salah wajabat kamila. Right? So now, Asr prayer is valid in the makruh time for Asr. Why? Because the whole time is salih li ada' is-salah. Right? So the prayer is valid with sin. Right? It's makruh tahriman. Because that has a juz' yasluh لإضافة الأداء إليه. At this moment, within the moment someone says Allahu Akbar with 10 minutes left for Asr, this is a juz' min waqt الصلاة. So it's صالح للأداء فيه. So السبب في الأداء is the moment in which you started praying. But when the time goes out, what is the cause for you praying? it cannot be ascribed to any moment within the time, because the time's gone. فَيُضَافُ إِلَى جُمْلَةِ الْوَقْتِ, then the prayer is ascribed to the entirety of the time. وَهُوَ كَامِل, and it's complete. وَالْكَامِل لَا يُؤَدَّى فِي النَّاقِصِ, and that which is complete cannot be fulfilled with the deficient. And that's, and this is there's a broad principle in the Hanafi school, لا يبنى القوي على الضعيف. So الوقت الكامل قوي فلا يبنى على الضعيف الذي هو وقت الكراهة لأنه وقت ناقص. Right? And so therefore, Fajr prayer, within Fajr time, every moment of Fajr was fit to pray Fajr in. Is there a makruh time for Fajr? No. If there's a haram time for Fajr, within Fajr time, which is such that you don't have enough time to finish it within the time. And that's where it would be obligatory. Actually, what would you have to do there? Sometimes it can be wajib to leave a wajib. You say, Allahu Akbar. Literally, let's just do an experiment. Can someone run a timer? We can do 2 rak'ahs of Fajr. Okay? Allahu Akbar. And I'm being a bit generous because what did I do? Yeah, I stood up from ruku'. I can't get myself not to. Okay? How long did that take? 22 seconds. And I did rafa' min al-ruku', which is, what is it? It's sunnah according to Abu Hanifa, wajib according to the mutaakhirin. So like that was being quick, right? Personally, I could probably read the Fatiha in like less than 10 seconds, comfortably. So like with reciting the Fatiha, could comfortably pray in 40 seconds, right? Don't get bad ideas from that, but if you wake up and you have 2 minutes left for Fajr, then, and if you studied fiqh, then you have no excuse. You do a minimum wudu, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, right? Because people make mistakes. You don't have to dry your skin. Right? You don't have to unroll your sleeves. You don't have to put on a kufi. You don't have to brush your hair. Because these are all adab. Right? But إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. And the hadith of tadyi' is-salat, that's even worse. And do of the wajibat what you can. Right? If you start making that a habit, then you have to make some serious muhasabah. But okay. That's something, there's discussion on that. Okay? If you left the wajib, then al-zahir na'am. But is it wajib بعد خروج الوقت أم مستحب? There's 2 opinions. Okay. But so if you prayed Fajr, within Fajr time, your beginning is ascribed to a moment within Fajr. But once the sun has risen, this is waqt naqis. So the prayer it was due upon you. Why are you doing qada? Because you missed it. Okay? Because you're commanded to perform Fajr in the time of Fajr. Your qada is ascribed. This is qada للصلاة التي وجبت في وقت الفجر, which is a waqt kamil. It's a complete time. So this kamil لا يؤدى بناقص. It cannot be fulfilled with the deficient, which is a prohibited time. So in our madhab, qada during sunrise is invalid. Lakin, this is very important. لا ينهى عنها العوام. A common person is not prohibited from doing that. لأن صحة الصلاة في قول مجتهد أولى من تفويتها. Because the validity of a prayer, according to any one mujtahid, is better than squandering the prayer fully. If someone's praying it, if they're that careful about their deen, they would have prayed within the time. So they're praying at this time, you don't tell them anything. Because people are not genetically Hanafi, right? Like they're Muslim, right? So, but the problem is what? If they were Hanafi and they knew it, what would they do? If they're Hanafi and they knew what to do, they would have been praying later. If they knew it and if they cared. So the problem is either lack of knowledge or lack of concern. One requires knowledge, the other requires inspiration, it requires targhib or tarhib, depending on the situation. But okay, enough of that. أولها عند طلوع الشمس إلى أن ترتفع وتبيض قدر رمح أو رمحين. When the sun is rising until it rises the extent of one spear length or two spear lengths, right? On the horizon, yani. Right? So it's above the horizon, the extent of a spear length or two, right? This requires, right? Right? Another opinion, right, is that this sunrise is the opposite of the sunset for Asr time. The rumh or the rumhain. The sun is close to the horizon, right? And some said that the rumh or the rumhain is the opposite of that. وَلَهُ وَجْهِ يعني. والثاني عند استوائها. The second is when the sun is at its zenith. في بطن السماء إلى أن تزول أي تميل إلى جهة المغرب. Right? Until it goes beyond the zenith, i.e. the shadow now starts increasing in the direction of the sunset. Right? And here, it's described that when عند استوائها, you can read in Tahtawi that the sun is considered zenith when the sun approaches the zenith when the shadow is decreasing and it appears to stop. When the shadow appears to stop and there's residual shadow, that is waqt al-zawal. And then when it moves beyond, so it starts growing the direction of the sunset, that is now, then that moment dhuhr is in, right? So, haqiqatan, the istiwa, waqt al-istiwa is a moment, right? 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 It's a moment. But to be cautious, you put a little extra there. So it's literally, if we know when dhuhr time is in, to be cautious, you put a few minutes before it, right? There are two opinions about how long waqt al-istiwa is. There's a lengthier istiwa time, and you can read up on it if you want to look it up. وَالثَّالِث عِنْدَ اصْفِرَارِهَا. The third of the times when it's prohibited and invalid to perform a prayer that was due before this time is when the sun yellows, right? i.e. when it's headed towards setting. يعني اصفرارها وضعفها حتى تقدر العين على مقابلتها, such that the eye can gaze directly in its direction. إلى أن تغرب, until it sets. Right? لقول سيدنا عقبة بن عامر رضي الله تعالى عنه ثلاث أوقات نهانا سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن نصلي فيها. There are 3 times the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم forbade us to pray in. وأن نقبر موتانا, and that we bury our dead in them, during them, right? عند طلوع الشمس, when the sun is rising, حتى ترتفع, until it's clearly risen. وعند زوالها حتى تزول, and during the zenith time until it goes past the zenith. وحين تضيف للغروب, and when it's headed towards setting, حتى تغرب, until it sets. رواه مسلم. معنى تضيف أي تميل, right? تضيف أي تميل, until it inclines towards setting, when it starts setting, right? والمراد بقوله أن نقبر صلاة الجنازة, and what's meant by burying our dead is performing the prayer related to burying the dead, right? Because of the first, the beginning of the hadith, 3 times the Prophet forbade us to pray in, right? Although there's ikhtilaf on that tafsir, right? To be honest, right? إذ الدفن غير مكروه, because burial during that time is not disliked. Because just imagine, Asr time, you took time to get to the graveyard, then what are you going to do? Wait till Maghrib to bury them? Then where are you going to pray Maghrib? Right? Right? كما لا يخفى. Right? فكن به عنها. So burying was used to refer to the prayer related to the burial, للملازمة بينهما, because of the necessary interrelation between them. وقد فسر بالسنة, and this has been explained, or detailed. الفسر هو الكشف والإيضاح, أي قد وضح, has been clarified by the Sunnah, right? And it's the same narrator actually, as Imam Tahtawi mentions. نهانا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن نصلي على موتانا عند 3. The Prophet said, the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم forbade us to pray over our deceased at 3 times. عند طلوع الشمس إلى آخره, when the sun is setting till the end. What's the takhrij you have of this hadith? Okay, yeah, they just take from each other. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يوفق أحدا. We should see how one has to give credit where credit is due. Dr. Salah Abul Hajj's edition of the Maraqi with his notes, it was done hastily. I hope there'd be a second edition because the text is not that strong in it, but his hadith referencing is far superior to any of the other editions. All the other editions, without exception that I've seen, the referencing is shameful. It's shameful. It's not. And people have excuse, etc. But in itself, and they're very, very noble people who've done it. They're all, but you need. وإذا أشرقت الشمس وهو في صلاة الفجر بطلت. If the sun rises when in Fajr prayer, the Fajr prayer is invalidated in our madhab. Right? And they mentioned that Abu Yusuf said, anhu, this is a narration, that if you're praying and the sun rises, stay motionless until the sun has risen and then finish it, and it'll turn valid. Okay? But that's a narration from him. That means be still for 15 minutes. Right? 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 فلا ينتقض وضوءه بالقهقه بعده. So if one laughed out loud after someone was praying and the sun rose and then they laughed out loud, then their wudu wouldn't break because they're no longer praying. And usually they ask this, someone looked, that somebody asked that this happened, what's the ruling, right? وعلى أنها تنقلب نفلا يبطل, right? But على أنها, and according to the narration that the prayer turns into a nafl, which is a weak narration, the wudu would also be broken. يبطل أي الوضوء. لكن, now here it's there in the sharh, right? This is very important. ولا ننهى كسال العوام عن صلاة الفجر وقت الطلوع. And we do not prohibit lazy, common people from praying fajr during sunrise, لأنهم قد يتركونها المرة, because they might leave it completely. والصحة على قول مجتهد أولى من الترك, because for them to do something valid according to one mujtahid is better for them than to leave the action fully. Right? And this is an important principle, right? Did anyone find the text about the التشدد from الطريقة المحمدية? Right? Yeah, we should look for it. Right? عدم التشدد على عامة الناس. If you look using the Shamila, because the Bariqa is in the Maktaba Shamila, you should be able to find it. التشدد, etc. So if an issue there's khilaf in, you don't make things difficult for the common person regarding them. You don't point them to every dispensation, no. You teach. When you teach them, you call them, you tell them the ahkam according to the madhab. When you call them, you apply the principle, you teach them according to the principles of ilm. When you call them to the principles of da'wah, which does not necessarily entail going into juz'iyat al-fiqh, except to the extent of the need to clarify what needs to be clarified. But when you deal with the actions of the common person, you need the unlearned person, al-ammi la madhhaba lahu. Right? They say, I'm Hanafi, I'm Shafi, they're whatever they are. If they knew, they'd know what to do. If they don't, right? You tell them going forward, and it depends on the maratib of the awam, which we may have talked about before, but we will talk about when the occasion comes. وَيَصِحُّ أَدَاءُ مَا وَجَبَ فِيهَا. It is valid to perform what was obligatory, what became obligatory within it. أي الأوقات الثلاثة لكن مع الكراهة. However, with dislike. Right? في ظاهر الرواية. مع الكراهة أي التحريمية. أي it's prohibitively disliked. Right? And the dislike, if a janazah comes at that time, is it better to pray it in that time or to wait? Right? And there's ikhtilaf in the madhab about it. You can find the summary of the issue in the hadiyah. كجنازة حضرت, such as a janazah that becomes present at يعني وسجدة تلاوة تليت فيها. Do you have كجنازة حضرت فيها? Anyone have فيها there in the matan? Anybody? كجنازة حضرت? No. كجنازة حضرت أي فيها. Such as a janazah that comes there. So where people are in the masjid and in the makruh time, a janazah comes. Right? right? The asl is that it is that emphasized not to delay the janazah, right? But the amal typically is that people wait till the next prayer time. So it needs, so theoretically, if the janazah comes at that time, so let's say everyone came for Fajr, but it just took extra time to wash the body or whatever happened. They washed the body, but there's criminal investigation still going on. So they're waiting. So they could pray. So, but janazah hadarat fiha. So the janazah came to the, during the time, then you can pray it within the time, and there's a qawl that it's better to wait till the sun has risen, right? Likewise for Asr, it's better to wait, right? وَيَصِحُ أَدَاء مَا وَجَبَ فِيهَا. It is valid to perform what became obligatory during that time. Because when does Salat al-Janazah become wajib? When the body comes. Because from the conditions of Sihhat Salat al-Janazah is the mayyit أو جزءه, or some part of them. In our madhab, we don't have Salat al-Janazah on the ghaib. وَآيَةٍ تُلِيَتْ فِيهَا, or a verse that was recited within it. So if a verse is recited within it, what's the ruling? It's valid, but with karaha, right? So here with karaha, this karaha tahrimiyya. The secondary opinion that you can pray it within the time, right? The janazah, etc. You can see it Tahtawi, he discusses that, right? So sajda tuliyat fiha. So what is he saying here? That someone, let's say they're reciting Quran after Fajr. So sun has risen, they recite ayah of sajda within the time of sunrise. Is it valid to perform? So let's say someone recited one of the ayat of sajda during Fajr. Could they perform the sajda during sunrise? It would be invalid. But if they recited the ayah of sajda during sunrise, then when did the sajdat al-sahu become, sajdat al-tilawa become wajib upon them? In the makruh time. So it would be valid to perform it there with karaha. So rather, it's superior, it's called upon to wait till you make it up after, right? And there's some khilaf you can see. Right? But the janazah, there's ikhtilaf, right? What he's mentioning is the majority opinion. The another, that, right? وَنَافِلَةٍ شَرَعَ فِيهَا, or a nafil that you began in the time. Someone wanted to do Salat al-Shukr, because just as the sun rose, Uncle Jamil rose up and went to Zubair and says, Beta, why don't you marry my daughter? So Zubair says, Allahu Akbar. He enters into prayer. And so, do you have to stop him? It's valid, but with karaha. But if it's in Zubair's case, please let him just finish, because miskeen, like, right? وَنَافِلَةٍ شَرَعَ فِيهَا is valid, but with karaha tahrim. The basis is you break it and you start it in waqt غير makruh. Right? So here, do you break it or complete it? There's khilaf. أو نذر أن يصلي فيها فيقطع ويقضي في كامل في ظاهر الرواية. So one breaks such a prayer. So if you started nafil during the makruh time, you break it, and then it's wajib to make it up, right? Because al-nafil yajib bi-shuru' ada'an wa qada'an, right? Al-nafil yajib bi-shuru', right? ويجب قضاء ما أفسده من نفل. Right? So one, a nafil yajib bi-shuru'. If you begin a nafil, it's wajib to complete it. That's number one. Principle number two, يجب قضاء ما أفسده من نفل. That if you started a nafil and you break it, it becomes wajib to make up. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تبطلوا أعمالكم. Do not negate your own actions. So if you started an action, it becomes wajib to complete it. And many other texts, both Quran and Sunnah, of not squandering one's actions. And there's many meanings to it that you can find in the... Right? And this is wajib, right? That it's wajib to break the prayer and then do it in a complete time, meaning outside the makruh times. فَإِن مَضَى عَلَيْهَا صَحَّ وَأَثِمْ. If one continues in it, it is valid, but one is sinful for doing something prohibitively disliked. كَمَا صَحَّ عَصْرُ يَوْمِهِ. Just as the asr of the same day is valid, بِأَدَائِهِ عِنْدَ الْغُرُوب. If performed during the time when the sun is setting, i.e. in the makruh time of asr. It's يصح كما يجب ويصح, or كما يفترض ويصح, as كما يفترض ويصح, right? As is obligatory and valid to perform the asr prayer if delayed till the makruh time. لبقاء سببه, because its cause remains. وهو الجزء المتصل به الأداء من الوقت. It is the moment connected to beginning the performance of the prayer of the time, right? Because the time is ظرف للأداء, right? The time is the ظرف, the literally the envelope, or is what encompasses the أداء. Okay. مع الكراهة, with it being prohibitedly disliked to have delayed the prayer. للتأخير. And this للتأخير, there's extensive discussion of is the prayer disliked or the delay disliked. And you can find the tahqiq in Ibn Abdin and elsewhere, but the distinction is subtle. I got told off for this one. Let's see because I spent a lot of time figuring out that Ibn Abdin says that I think, if I'm correct, that what's disliked it's not the ta'khir is disliked, but the prayer itself is ما هو الفرق بين الحكمين? What's the difference? I had no idea. I was just focused that there's two rulings. This one is more correct, but I didn't know what's the difference between the two rulings. It says the hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwuri. Before you can judge between two things, understand A, understand B, then you can appreciate why one is stronger than the other. So I was just lovingly, I hope, told off. Alhamdulillah. للتأخير. Allah. Okay. مع الكراهة للتأخير, because of the delay المنهي عنه, لا لذات الوقت, not for the time itself, right? And this is disputed, right? بخلاف عصر مضى, as opposed to performing a asr مضى أي يعني من الفوائد of missed asr prayer, of a قضاء of asr للزومه كاملا, because it and للزومه أي في الذمة, يعني للزومه because it became incumbent أي في الذمة كاملا بخروج وقته. Right? Once the time goes out, this is what we discussed in the beginning, because when it entered, during the time, the cause of the prayer is any moment is the moment in the time when you started the prayer. All of the time is fit to pray, because the time of that prayer, even the disliked time for asr, right? But once the time goes out, the prayer is ascribed to the full time. You're making this asr up. When you're performing this asr, so let's take two things. You're performing the current asr prayer in the prohibitively disliked time. Right? When did the asr prayer, which asr are you praying? The asr for this time. The makruh tahriman time, is it part of the time? Yes. So what is the sabab for your praying? Is the moment when you started the prayer, which is within the time. So the time is ascribed, your performance is ascribed to that moment. The moment is from within the time. It's valid, but because it's in a makruh time, either the delay is makruh, according to this interpretation, or if you consider that you prayed it in a makruh time, you're fulfilling the obligation, but the prayer itself is makruh, tahriman. And you can be rewarded for the prayer, you can be fulfilling the command, and be rewarded for it, and be sinful for it at the same time. And this is discussed. So that's one, that seems to be the stronger interpretation. I'm not going to try to explain the difference. The other is, let's say someone used to fall asleep on the way home from Asr, and they'd miss Asr prayer regularly. So now it's Asr time. They decide in the makruh time to make up a previous Asr prayer. Right? The makruh time is a waqt naqis, is a deficient time. Why? لِتَعَلُّقِ النَّهِي بِهِ, because it's connected to the prohibition. Right? So in this deficient time, what are you trying to make up? You're trying to make up a prayer for a asr that you missed. Now when you make it up, what is that prayer ascribed to? What is its sabab? Is that time in which you were commanded to pray, and you could have prayed at any moment within. But now the prayer, because it can't be ascribed to any moment, it is ascribed to that time. And the time as a whole is kamil. وَلَا يُؤَدَّى الْكَامِلْ فِي النَّاقِصِ, and the complete is not fulfilled in the deficient. So it would not be valid. And this is discussed, the underlying reasoning for this is discussed, would take us way outside our scope right now. Right? So he says, وَالْأَوْقَاتُ الثَّلَاثَةُ الْمَذْكُورَةُ يُكْرَهُ فِيهَا النَّافِلَةُ كَرَاهَةَ تَحْرِيمٍ. And in these three times, a nafil prayer is valid but prohibitively disliked. وَلَوْ كَانَ لَهَا سَبَبٍ, even if it has a cause. Right? كَالْمَنْذُورِ, if you vowed to pray during that time. وَرَكْعَتَيِ الطَّوَافِ, or the 2 rak'ahs for the tawaf. Because after each full tawaf, one performs 2 rak'ahs. Right? وَرَكْعَتَيِ الْوُضُوءِ, you made wudu during that time, there's a cause. وَتَحِيَّةِ الْمَسْجِدِ, you enter masjid during sunrise time, you don't pray. In our madhab, if you sit down, the tahiyyat al-masjid is not invalidated. Rather, in our madhab, it's considered disliked to be standing waiting for the prayer, if everyone else is sitting down, especially. Right? It's considered to be as if you're saying, get on with it. Right? So you enter, for example, Maghrib, you enter the masjid, people are sitting, you haven't prayed Tahiyyat al-Masjid yet. Right? So you sit down and you don't lose Tahiyyat al-Masjid. In the Shafi'i school, you lose it. But in our madhab, and they say this is لا يراها فيه خلاف الشافعية here, which is the exception. That here you don't consider the difference of opinion of the Shafi'is, because ارتكاب المكروه في المذهب أشد من الخروج من خلاف الغير. Because doing something disliked in your own madhab is worse than than failing to avoid the difference of opinion of another school. right? وتحية المسجد. And you can see the fiqh of تحية المسجد when we come to it, or you can read ahead. It's not a horror movie that if you find out who did it, it'll spoil the whole story. والسنن الرواتب, to emphasize sunnahs, right? وفي مكة, and it's disliked to do nafil in these times, even in Mecca. وقال أبو يوسف رحمه الله لا تكره النافلة حال الاستواء يوم الجمعة لأنه استثني في حديث عقبة رضي الله تعالى عنه. And Abu Yusuf said that the nafil is not disliked when when the sun is at its zenith on Friday, because it has been made an exception of in the hadith of Uqba, right? The asl of the madhab is what's mentioned. Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam like this, and some other works, including Al-Hawi al-Qudsi, which is much earlier, gave fatwa on this. But and actually even Al-Haskafi took from, I believe, may have inclined to or taken this, I forget, you can see it in the place. But I have a footnote here that رده. Is there a footnote in your one here? Yeah, no, it says قال أبو يوسف لا تكره, etc., etc. Is there a footnote? What do you have? Okay. Yeah. What's your edition? Okay. Al-Urabi? Okay. Not Hadith Uqba. قال أبو يوسف. You have anything? No. Okay. So Ibn Abdin didn't agree with this, right? And he shows that in our madhab, the nafil is makruh during these 3 times, including on Yawm al-Jumu'ah. But in reality, waqt al-istiwa is the moment before dhuhr enters. So before that, you want to make nafil. Now some masajid, this comes in Salat al-Bab al-Jumu'ah, but we do Jumu'ah weekly, so it's just good to know. They don't give enough time, right? Between Dhuhr time entering and when the khutbah begins, right? Now when the khutbah begins, it's makruh tahriman to initiate prayer, right? If that happens, and they used to do it in Jordan, for example, some of our attitudinally divergent brethren, they try to make the point that it's not sunnah, there's no sunnah for Jumu'ah. It's an old issue, right? They resurrect like dead issues, right? And this was refuted, right? There's an opinion related from Imam Ahmad that it's not sunnah, but it's mustahab, it's recommended, right? And they dig up these strange opinions, but they impose it on everybody. So some masjids, you go there, and they were of the attitudinally divergent variety, that we were stuck in the neighborhood I lived in such a masjid. So what do? Ask the ulama. Says, begin the prayer, and even if the khutbah begins, just finish it off. And al-ithma alayhim. That's what they said. I'm not convinced by that because of the firm prohibition in our madhab of praying during Salat al-Jumu'ah. We better, if someone can, to pray afterwards. But I was corrected, and we'd have these arguments with Shaykh Hassan, lovingly. He says, do you think the awam going to do all of that? I said, the awam in India pray like there's no other prayer they'll be performing in their life. Like, honestly, they go in Pakistan, like some uncle who's like, you're worried like, like after Jummah, like sunnah, like I've done my sunnah and even prayed 2 rak'ahs after. The guy's still doing 4 rak'ahs. Like, are they making up the whole week's prayer? Like, what's going on? Like, I've been tempted to just ask, what are you praying? Right? Because there's, but there is leeway there. Like if they come late, like if they start the Jummah early, if you start the Sunnah, you can finish the 4 rakahs. Right? Unless you're sure that you're going to make up 4 rakahs afterwards, right? And then he tells us what are the other makruh times, right? There's other times that are makruh, right? So we'll look at those next time. Bi'idhnillah, and there's many, and then we'll get to Babul Adhan. Please remind me, I'll share something. One of the most neglected of sunnahs in our deen is the adhan. Not just performing it, but its meanings. Imam Burhanuddin al-Biqa'i, who I have a qada of long-term expressions of respect, because Imam al-Biqa'i spoke, let's just say he wasn't exactly a fan of Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. So I wasn't exactly a fan of him for a long time. Never said anything against him. He's an imam, I'm an ignoramus. But he's a great, great imam, notwithstanding what he had to say about Ibn Arabi. And his tafsir, Nazm al-Durar, is brilliant. And other works. Many scholars have written commentaries on the adhan. Amongst them, Imam Burhanuddin al-Biqa'i, it's an amazing thing that why is the adhan repeated? Right? Like why don't you just give the adhan once in a lifetime, right? All of these, because of all that is summarized in it of meanings. Why do we repeat the Allahu Akbar in it 4 times? Okay. When else do we say Allahu Akbar 4 times? Eid, what else? Janazah, right? And both, there's a relationship between both. We make the testification of faith at the beginning and at the end, right? And Hayya al-Salah and Hayya al-Falah, etc. So there's a lot of, it deserves mention. Okay? It's not mansus alayhi fil madhab, but the ulama said because of how significant the adhan is, that if the adhan is not given, some of the ulama mention that there's merit in, and we'll also look, of course, when we come to adhan, that there's many places. Some of the ulama took it to more than 30 places out besides the prayer time when it's recommended to give adhan. Amongst them that's useful, if a child's crying inconsolably. Right? If it doesn't console the child, at least it consoles the parent, to be honest. You don't know what else to do. Give the adhan, at least it'll give you something to أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, right? So the child's heart doesn't go to rest, at least for a while your heart can be at rest, right? It can be a bit disturbing when someone's crying inconsolably. And other types, if someone is in shock, etc., if one is lost, there's hadith about it. Someone's traveling, to give the adhan as they're traveling away. As we mentioned many places. Ibn Abdin makes a lengthy list gathered from a few places. So we'll be looking at the ahkam of adhan. So diagram the section. There's just one thing I wanted to mention. And why it's important to read hadith, right? And something that the fuqaha generally don't mention, because the fuqaha assume that that you believe in following the Prophet ﷺ, right? So if you believe in following the Prophet ﷺ, like you'd read hadith. How else are you going to follow the Prophet ﷺ? Like, right? So the Hanafis generally don't mention a section or a chapter on the virtues of walking to prayer, right? And there are many hadiths on the merits of walking to prayer. And I asked Shaykh Badib, who's sitting in the other room, what do the Shafi'is say about the adab of walking to the prayer? In their fiqh books, they don't mention it either. except in a large, like illa dimnan, except within mention of something else. So you could find it scattered here and there. Why? Because the hadiths are so clear on the adab of walking to the prayer. There are many adab related to walking to the prayer, and they're important. A lot of people, if they're running late to the prayer, they'll drive quickly, they'll rush. It's important to, to read that, whether in Riyadh al-Salihin, the chapters on prayer, or elsewhere, right? And there's many virtues. Some of them are connected to the prayer, to congregational prayer, but others are highlight the to walking there bis-sakinati wal-waqar, walking there calmly, and of getting to the masjid early and waiting for the prayer, of not disturbing those who are already in the line, of not stepping over people to get to, etc. And there's many adab which are explicitly mentioned in the hadith, and even, is it better to live close to the masjid or far from the masjid? Right? So Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabahani, who has this amazing abridgment of Riyadh al-Salihin, which is translated into English, and they have the text of the Arabic in it, and it's a reasonably good translation. It's a good translation, published I think by Turath Publishing, and they made it actually reasonably affordable as well, right? The Mukhtasar Riyadh al-Salihin, that has related chapters, right? And of course, the full meaning of that is walking to the masjid itself, right? But it also applies to any, right? But it also applies how one goes to the prayer, especially this idea of with sakina and waqar. Also, then one goes to prayer, from the wisdom of there being sunnahs before and getting early to the prayer, is to gather one's heart before the fard prayer. That's the wisdom of there being sunnah before, of getting early to the prayer, of making dhikr before, etc. But even when one can't, so one's at work, don't just jump from one thing into the prayer, but alaykum bis sakina wal waqar. Allow yourself to be calmed and just gather, even if it's moments. Sometimes you can't afford to because of what's going on. But even moments of gathering, there's many hadiths, right, related. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for ease and facilitation. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Yeah, that's an. It's a narration from him. That's not a relied upon position. That's actually not his. That's not the established opinion of Abu Yusuf either. An, it's a narration. It's related. Sometimes they mention it because there's a line of reasoning related to it, etc., which one can investigate and find. Sometimes they also mention it. So if someone did this, then there is an opinion. But that applies to the al-Mufti al-Mahir.
So it might be impractical, to wait for 15 minutes, etc. And I know some people are in my position.
So we don't act upon it. Simple.
What about for midday? It's just a moment, so it's almost.
No. When you can't act about, that's the opinion of Abu Yusuf relates to Fajr, the Fard of Fajr, right, for example, right? There's no Fard before Dhuhr.
So in this section of Makruhat, the first hadith he mentions, and even the hadith we're about to come to for Wednesday or our next class, for the first one he mentions Rawahu Muslim, and for the upcoming hadith he mentions Rawahu Shaykhan. Previously he never mentioned the narrators. What is his reasoning for mentioning them now?
He did, right? He references more in the Imdad, right? Right. So yeah, it's sometimes the ulama they're someone really wanted to like do a search, they're relying on certain texts, and they come to a particular place. So there's many hadiths related to it, and now we're coming to the maqsood, which is the prayer. So he opened other texts, so it's easier to reference. So he references them, right? Like Ibn Abdin, when we talk about Ghurar al-Azkar or Sharh Durar al-Bihar, there's a book that's not mentioned for the first 130 pages of Hashit Ibn Abdin, and then it gets mentioned once, and the next X number of pages he refers to it multiple times, and then it doesn't get mentioned for a long, long time. Why? Because he referred to it, so it's probably there, and so he keeps going back to it. And then he put it away, and there's other texts that are more important. So sometimes there's good reasons, and sometimes there's just bad reasons, right? There's bad reasons. But in general, you take references for anything from their sources. So even if someone quoted like Rawahul Muslim from a text like this, which is not a hadith work, if you're going to memorize it, especially in our time, it's so easy. You look up two quote, just put it in quotes, put it in the Shamila, it'll take you 5 seconds to find the hadith reference, right? If you have a phone, like if you want to find in the main references of hadith, there's a reasonably good app. What's it called? Jami' al-Kutub al-Tis'a. Are you an iPhone user? Yeah. So it's a really elegant app, right? Right? So you want to look up a hadith that's in the main books. Of course, the Shamila, and there's a al-Bahth al-Mutaqaddim fi Shamila. We could do a session sometime to where to look things up, etc. The problem in the Shamila is that there's way too many books in there. So you find all these things, and they put all things together, but there's some really precious things. You saw the stuff on the Salat al-Ishraq, right? Yeah, I nerded out. There's of course a lot more to be found on Salat al-Ishraq, because it's there, like the Shuruh of the Mishkat, etc. But it's useful, but the thing to be careful of is, it's good to get mentorship on it. What are reliable things? What are not reliable things? A way to start off in a work like that is to know specifically, is to just narrow your focus, right? If you're looking for shuruh of hadith, just look in very few limited shuruh. You can actually, under shuruh al-hadith, you can look under specific books, for example, right? It makes it easier. So we can do a session sometime on just some guiding principles to look things up, right? Like in hadith books, don't look in all the books of hadith, because you're going to get so lost, right? But there's ways. Likewise, shuruh of hadith, you look in a few, and you can pre-specify a couple of books. One of the ones where you'll find a large percentage of the hadith you're looking for. There's 3 commentaries that will take care of most of the hadiths that you'll need to look for, right? One is, of the spoken hadith of the Prophet, Fayd al-Qadir of al-Munawi. Fayd al-Qadir, Sharh al-Jami' al-Saghir. Because the Jami' al-Saghir of Imam Suyuti has 10,000 spoken hadiths of the Prophet. And Fayd al-Qadir is a very rich commentary. But of course, Imam al-Munawi is Shafi'i, but the hadith that are not specifically about legal ruling related ahkam, and there's amazing things in there. And Imam al-Munawi was brilliant. He was a blessed man, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And the second is Mirqat al-Mafatih, Sharh Mishkat al-Masabih by Mullah Ali al-Qari from Herat. But like many people from those lands, he had to leave his homeland due to tribulations that were taking place there. So he moved to the Haram. And radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So Mishkat al-Masabih contains the hadiths in the Kutub al-Sitta plus key hadiths from the secondary source, tertiary sources outside the Kutub al-Sitta. Got good 6,000 hadiths in there. And it has many, many great commentaries, but Mullah Ali al-Qari's is a well-rounded commentary. There's many other great commentaries. That's second. Third is Ibn Allan's Sharh on Riyadh al-Salihin. Right? Then of course, if you're a separate thing, if you're looking for hadiths in terms of what do the Hanafis say about it, well, Mullah Ali al-Qari is very much Hanafi, right? You could add, if you're looking for Hanafi Sharh, Imam al-Aini's commentary on Bukhari, on Abu Dawood, and Imam al-Aini's commentary on Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, called Nukhab al-Afkar, Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar. It's there in the Shamila. So al-Aini, 3 commentaries in there, at least, in the Shuruh al-Hadith. Also Ibn Malak. Now, of course, just be careful. Ibn Malak has a sharh on As-Saghani's Jama' Bayn al-Sahihain. I forget the title escapes me right now. Mabariq al-Azhar, Sharh Mashariq al-Anwar. Yeah, the great muhaddith of Lahore from the 6th or 7th century. The earliest muhaddithin of India. But his son has a sharh on Masabih al-Sunnah of al-Baghawi. It's also ascribed as Ibn Malak, but always check, because that's Muhammad ibn Abdul Latif. But noted Hanafi. Al-Kashmiri, Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri, he has Faydul Bari, Sharh Sahih. So there's a bunch of other ones. Like for Hanafi, we'll do a session just to go navigate. We could probably put it on, like connect the computers to show. So there's ways of, if one's looking up a hadith, etc. But the simple, most of the hadiths, like as a fiqh, you can find the books of fiqh. You want to look up the meaning of a hadith, etc. To know where to look. But to reference the hadiths, again, there's kutub takhrij al-hadith, right? So we'll do a session on that. Where to look up a fiqh issue, where to look up a hadith. The tafsir is obvious, but one of the keys is sometimes it helps to look everywhere, because you'll find amazing things, but you have to know how to sift through it. So we'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Shall we start the other class in 5 minutes? Yes. No, that's awful. موسوعة عشان there's a website. البحث المتقدم في الموسوعة عشان It's like al-maktaba.org.
Yeah, yeah.
There's an app, but the app is really bad. It's called, the website, there's an app called Asfar. You have to download the actually, but it's so bad that they misspelled Asfar. You look for it with a Hamza, you won't find it. And they have advertising in the app. And you know, something is mash'oom. First time I went, it had an ad for the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Then there was evangelical Christian groups advertising, and they had a refutation of Islam. That's all within my first 4 usages of the app, and it keeps crashing.
How about Jama al-Kutub Tisa? Is this the app?
No,
Jama al-Kutub Tisa.
yes, that's the one.
Was this one?
Yeah. The that has some. But we'll go through that, inshallah.
When I searched for it, the first ad, I think, was the Bible. Oh, wait, hold on, it's after search. And then the second result was Arabic Bible.
Will we be reading from Hadiyah tomorrow?
Did we agree on it?
So we'll start. We'll start the Maraqi fasting a week this Monday, on the week this Wednesday. Because on Wednesday, yeah, at 1:30, this Wednesday, we're going to have a substitute teacher for the Mutammima class. We'll do a collective dua. We're meeting somebody, or possibly Sunday. Okay, so I need 5 minutes so I can start the other 3 minutes. If I start. Okay, everyone, jump onto the ship.
You gotta stretch my
See, I have multiple other copies,
Yeah.
but the problem is they're still in the storage.
Oh, okay. No, inshallah. You bring me one. Inshallah, thank you.
It's the same edition that SeekersGuidance uses.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, it's not the one that Shaykh Faraz really.
No, this one I think is easier.
Wait, which one didn't like that really?
That's right. That's what I thought.
Shalom.
Dr. Salah has a hand.
It
did say it's
the
really
best
easy.
previous. Probably
Sorry,
the worst
best
edition of it.
Oh, I see. Is that the one? What's it called? Has a different name, right? 2 volumes?
Limited. It's 3 volumes. Because there was one place where he's correct and the other editions are wrong.
Maximum 10 minutes, inshallah.
Yes, I've SeekersGuidance edition.
Yeah, thank you so much. On Wednesday,
I
inshallah.
thought I saw you with the Bahtawi the other day.
No, I don't have it. That's the explanation of it. I don't have this one.
Wait, but you do have Bahtawi?
Yeah, but it's so difficult. Yeah, but it's so difficult to follow up with it. 'Cause I go- Yeah, just,
It has the entire Maraqi in the top.
but there's a sharh on
Maraqi's everything.
okay, everything on the top. So when he reads, I notice he goes one here, then I have to go jump, find the others. Where?
Okay, yeah, so sometimes he'll
Yeah.
read the metin first.
Yeah.
So that means he's reading just what's in the bracket.
So this is the same book?
Yeah, that's like one reader.
Oh, no way. Oh, I gotta sit one day next to you guys to see how he's doing it, because I didn't understand
So
anything.
sometimes before he begins the section, he'll
Yeah.
read just the whole metin.
Okay.
All the way to the end, and then he goes back.
Okay, so, yeah, I gotta sit with you on it.
It was a heavy class.
I have to sit with you, Hamza. To see, yeah, because I need to know how he's doing it.
I mean, it is useful, so.
Yeah.
I'll be trying it. It's
No,
just
no,
a-
inshallah, I have
I'm
it.
trying to find somebody who wants it, but no one does.
What's the difference between this one and the one you have?
So the one that I have doesn't have Bahtawi in the bottom.
Oh,
But Shaykh Faraz uses Bahtawi a lot, so it's very useful.
yeah, yeah.
Like if you look at my copy, I underline everything that he mentioned in Bahtawi. So you can see exactly how much
Yeah.
he sources it. Right?
What verse are we?